people looking half dead, walking on the sidewalk harder than a match head. But at night it's different.
And if she should tell you, come closer.
Welcome back to the Rock Vault, where the amps are always hot. Tonight, we're traveling deep into the heart of the 1960s to celebrate 10 unappreciated bands from the 1960s that we'll never forget. These aren't the Beatles or Stones, but the unsung legends whose sound still echoes like hidden treasure. When we talk about the raw and restless side of British rock in the 1960s, the Pretty Things deserve a place in that conversation. Formed by guitarist Dick Taylor, who had once been a founding member of the Rolling Stones, the band channeled the same R&B fire, but with a sharper edge. Their early singles crackled with garage rock energy, and by the late 60s they were diving headfirst into psychedelia with fearless abandon. In 1968, they released SF Sorrow, a swirling, ambitious concept album that predated Tommy by The Who, yet rarely gets the credit for being one of the first true rock operas. Listening to Phil May's untamed vocals against a backdrop of fuzzed-out guitars and kaleidoscopic production was like stepping into a fever dream. They weren't polished. They weren't trying to be. The Pretty Things carried that dangerous, unpredictable energy that made rock feel alive and slightly out of control. They influenced everyone from David Bowie to generations of punk musicians, but in America, their fame never rose to the level of their contemporaries. For many fans who stumbled onto their records in a dusty record shop or late-night FM radio broadcast, discovering the Pretty Things felt like finding a secret society. Their music wasn't for everyone, but for those who got it, it was a revelation. You could imagine teens in 1968 sitting cross-legged on shag carpets, incense burning, headphones on, letting SF Sorrow transport them to a surreal landscape of stories and sounds. That's the magic of the Pretty Things. They embodied the wild side of the 60s, the part that didn't play by the rules and didn't care about mainstream approval. Their legacy may not have been carved into the charts, but it lives on in the attitude and experimentation that defined an era. And for those who were lucky enough to hear them in their prime, the memory still burns bright, like a secret you can't wait to share with anyone who loves rock's untamed spirit. In the
All around, people looking half dead, walking on the sidewalk harder than a match head. But at night it's different.
midst of a decade charged with revolution, protests, and rock's rawest edges, the Lovin Spoonful carved their own space with something warmer, sunshine folk rock. Formed in Greenwich Village in 1965 and led by John Sebastian, this band blended jug band charm with sharp pop sensibilities. While their music had a lighthearted glow, it carried a sophistication that gave them staying power. Hits like Do You Believe in Magic and Summer in the City brought joy into a turbulent world, becoming instant snapshots of carefree afternoons and sticky summer nights. Their instrumentation was deceptively simple. Sebastian's breezy vocals, Zali Zalyanovsky's playful guitar work, Steve Boone's grounding bass, and Joe Butler's rhythm. Together they crafted songs that felt like they were written for front porches and open windows, but still had the muscle to chart high. By 1966, they had racked up multiple top 10 hits. Yet in the long history of 60s rock, they often slip into the shadows of flashier bands. For those who grew up with them, though, the Lovin Spoonful were more than background music. They were memory makers. Picture teenagers huddled around transistor radios in the summer of '66, the laughter of friends mixing with the sound of Summer in the City blasting from tinny speakers. Or imagine young couples at drive-in theaters, windows down, Do You Believe in Magic playing softly on the car radio, while they dreamed about futures that felt wide open. Part of their legacy was their ability to capture fleeting emotions, the optimism of youth, the glow of romance, the sense that music could freeze time. Unlike some bands of their era, they didn't need heavy distortion or psychedelic experimentation to make a mark. Their power came from melody, heart, and a touch of whimsy that made even ordinary days feel special. It's easy to overlook them now in conversations dominated by giants like the Stones or Hendrix, but when you revisit their catalog, you rediscover how vital they were to folk rock's rise. They influenced peers like the Mamas and the Papas and helped pave the way for countless singer-songwriters of the 1970s. The Lovin Spoonful may not have carried the rebellious fire of garage rock or the sprawling vision of psychedelia, but they were the band that reminded us that joy itself was revolutionary. And for anyone who lived through those summers, hearing them today is like stepping back into the golden haze of youth, when every day held promise and every song felt like sunshine. If there was ever a band that captured the raw, untamed heartbeat of garage rock in the mid-1960s, it was The Seeds. Formed in Los Angeles and fronted by the eccentric Sky Saxon, they were the wild children of the scene. Rebellious, hypnotic, and a little dangerous. Their sound was built on fuzz-laden guitars, swirling organ riffs, and Saxon's snarling, almost otherworldly delivery. It was primal and unpolished, but that's exactly what made it so electric. Songs like Pushing Too Hard became anthems for restless youth who wanted music that reflected their frustration and fire. The Seeds stood apart from their peers by leaning into minimalism and intensity. Every note felt urgent. Every lyric teetered between madness and revelation. They didn't care about polish or commercial gloss. They wanted to shake you awake. And for a brief, shining moment, they did. In 1966, their raw energy broke through to the national stage. But like many garage bands, their flame burned quickly and brightly before fading into cult status. Still, for the kids who first heard them blasting through static-filled AM radios, the Seeds were unforgettable. Imagine a teenager in '66, lying on their bed with the lights low, transistor balanced on the nightstand, and hearing that opening riff of Pushing Too Hard. It felt like the music was speaking directly to them. Rebellion pressed into vinyl. The Seeds never became household names, but their fingerprints are all over the future of rock. Their snarling edge and stripped-down sound were years ahead of punk, inspiring everyone from Iggy Pop to later garage revivalists. They proved you didn't need virtuoso solos or stadium anthems to leave an impact. You just needed raw attitude and a voice that demanded to be heard. Today, revisiting the Seeds is like opening a time capsule of the underground '60s. They weren't the ones playing Woodstock or topping international charts, but they were just as vital, carving out a space for misfits, rebels, and dreamers who wanted something a little more jagged than the mainstream offered. And for anyone who felt like they didn't quite fit in, the Seeds' chaotic energy made perfect sense. Few bands from the 1960s embodied the restless experimentation of Los Angeles' Sunset Strip quite like Love. Formed by Arthur Lee, Love fused folk, rock, psychedelia, and soul into a sound that felt both mystical and urgent. Their songs weren't just tracks on a record. They were sonic paintings, filled with ornate arrangements, poetic lyrics, and a haunting sense of beauty that set them apart from the harder edges of their contemporaries. Their 1966 self-titled debut introduced the world to a band unafraid to cross boundaries. But it was the albums that followed, particularly Forever Changes in 1967, that cemented their reputation as visionary. Strings, horns, and layered acoustic guitars wove together under Lee's enigmatic voice, creating a record that critics hailed as one of the greatest of the decade. Yet despite its brilliance, Love never achieved the mainstream success their peers enjoyed. Their refusal to tour heavily limited their exposure, leaving them more as cult heroes than household names. For fans who discovered them in real time, though, Love was unforgettable. Imagine a summer evening in '67, incense burning in a friend's apartment, and the needle dropping on Alone Again or those mariachi-inspired horns blended with psychedelic strums created a feeling like no other, part dream, part revelation. The music seemed to whisper secrets only you could understand. the kind of songs you carried with you long after the record stopped spinning. Love's story is one of brilliance that never fully broke into the mainstream spotlight, but perhaps that's part of their allure. They remained the kind of band you had to seek out, the kind of group you recommended to friends when you wanted to share something truly special. While the Doors, who once opened for Love, rose to superstardom, Love themselves remained in the shadows, their influence quietly shaping generations of musicians from punk to indie rock. Looking back, Love wasn't just another psychedelic band. They were a reminder of how deeply rock music could stir the soul. For those who caught them in their prime, the memory of Arthur Lee's soaring voice and the band's intricate arrangements will always be a treasured secret of the 60s, a gem hidden just beneath the surface of rock's golden era.
And if she should tell you, come closer.
The Zombies were never the loudest band of the British invasion, but they may have been the most sophisticated. Formed in St. Albans, England, in 1964, their sound was built on Colin Blunstone's ethereal vocals and Rod Argent's haunting organ, giving them a moodier, jazz-tinged texture than many of their peers. Their early single, She's Not There, turned heads with its minor key mystery, while Tell Her No showcased their knack for weaving pop hooks into something deeper, more emotional. Yet despite their brilliance, they were often overshadowed by flashier names of the era. By the late 60s, they had grown more ambitious. Their 1968 album Odessey and Oracle, recorded at Abbey Road, became a masterpiece of Baroque pop. Tracks like Time of the Season revealed a band stretching the boundaries of what rock could be. Lush harmonies, intricate arrangements, and an almost dreamlike quality. But timing worked against them. The group had already disbanded by the time the album gained traction, leaving them unable to enjoy the success they had worked so hard for. For fans who stumbled onto their records, though, the Zombies were unforgettable. Imagine being a teenager in 1965, the radio crackling late at night as She's Not There slipped through the static. The mysterious vocals and eerie organ carried a feeling unlike anything else, as if the song was whispering secrets from another world. It wasn't just pop. It was atmosphere, mood, and mystery wrapped into 3 minutes. Even today, the Zombies feel timeless. Their music conjures the image of dimly lit dance halls, late-night drives, and the strange mix of innocence and complexity that defined the 60s. They weren't chart juggernauts, but they carved a place in the hearts of listeners who craved something more artful than bubblegum pop. And when you revisit their catalog now, it's hard not to marvel at how modern their sound still feels. The Zombies may not have reached the superstardom of the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, but they left behind songs that continue to haunt, inspire, and endure. For those who were there, they're remembered as a band that gave the British invasion a darker, more elegant shade. And for new generations, they remain one of the great treasures waiting to be rediscovered. Psychedelic rock in the 1960s had no shortage of wild experimentation, but the Electric Prunes stood out as one of the most daring. Formed in Los Angeles in 1965, they fused garage rock grit with psychedelic strangeness, crafting songs that felt like they came from another dimension. Their breakout single, I Had Too Much to Dream, Last Night, in 1966, captured the trippy disorientation of the era with fuzzed-out guitars, haunting vocals, and an atmosphere that sounded equal parts dream and nightmare. It was the perfect encapsulation of what was happening musically and culturally. A restless generation searching for something beyond the ordinary. What made the Electric Prunes so unique was their willingness to push boundaries. Their soundscapes were drenched in effects, wah pedals, distortion, and reverb layered in ways that were radical at the time. They weren't afraid to experiment with form, mood, and even electronics, bridging the gap between garage rock and full-blown psychedelia. While their commercial peak was brief, their sonic fingerprints can be heard in the rise of experimental rock and even early progressive bands that followed. For those who heard them when they first hit the airwaves, the Electric Prunes felt like a secret portal into another world. Imagine a teenager in 1967 lying in the dark, headphones on, as I Had Too Much to Dream pulsed through the speakers, the fuzz guitar like a buzzing neon light, the vocals like a half-remembered vision. It was music that mirrored the surreal nights of the 60s, when reality and imagination blurred. Though they never reached the superstar heights of The Doors or Jefferson Airplane, the Electric Prunes earned a loyal cult following. Their boldness paved the way for bands who would later take psychedelia even further. They also captured the mood of the counterculture in a way few others did. Strange, slightly dangerous, but undeniably captivating. Looking back, the Electric Prunes remind us that not all rock history is written in the charts. Some of the most exciting music was happening on the fringes, in smoky clubs, and on late-night radio shows, where adventurous listeners found bands like this. Their legacy lies in their fearlessness, their ability to turn distortion and atmosphere into a new kind of poetry. For fans who lived through it, hearing the Electric Prunes again is like stepping into a technicolored dream that still hums with electricity today.
A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plan.
When the Byrds first took the stage in Los Angeles in 1965, they didn't just bring folk and rock together. They created a whole new sound that would define a generation. Built around Roger McGuinn's chiming 12-string Rickenbacker, David Crosby's harmonies, and Gene Clark's songwriting, their music shimmered with both folk intimacy and rock power. They took Dylan's poetic lyrics and gave them electric wings, turning Mr. Tambourine Man into a hit that changed the direction of popular music overnight. Their sound was bright, visionary, and utterly timeless. What made the Byrds so vital was their versatility. They could soar through jangly folk rock, dive into psychedelia, or even lay the groundwork for country rock, years before it became mainstream. Their influence was massive, shaping artists from Tom Petty to R.E.M. Yet, despite these achievements, they often lived in the shadow of the era's bigger names, their legacy treasured most by those who sought something just a little more thoughtful, a little more cosmic. For fans who remember hearing them in real time, the Byrds weren't just another band. They were a gateway. Imagine it's the summer of 1965. You're cruising down the highway with the windows rolled down, the radio DJ queuing up, "Turn, turn, turn." Those ringing guitars filled the air like sunlight. And suddenly, the chaos of the world outside felt just a bit easier to bear. The music was hopeful, spiritual even, and it stuck with you long after the song ended. The Byrds were proof that rock could be both intellectual and visceral, combining soaring harmonies with lyrics that tapped into ancient wisdom and contemporary unrest. While their lineup changes and internal tensions kept them from reaching the commercial peaks of bands like the Beatles, their music became the soundtrack for those who craved depth along with melody. Looking back, the Byrds stand as one of the most important, underrated bands of the 60s. They weren't the Stadium Kings, but they left a blueprint for nearly every subgenre that followed: folk rock, psychedelia, country rock, and beyond. And for those who grew up with their records spinning on the turntable, the Byrds will always be remembered as the sound of wings taking flight in a decade that desperately needed hope. If there was ever a band that embodied raw power and rebellion in the 1960s, it was Detroit's MC5. Formed in 1964, the Motor City Five weren't just playing rock, they were detonating it. Their music was loud, political, and unapologetically in your face. Driven by Wayne Kramer and Fred Sonic Smith's ferocious guitars, Rob Tyner's fiery vocals, and a rhythm section that hit like a freight train. Long before punk took shape, MC5 were already preaching its gospel, screaming for revolution with amplifiers turned all the way up. Their live performances were legendary, chaotic, electric, and often politically charged. With manager John Sinclair, They became tied to the counterculture and anti-establishment movements of the late 60s. Their 1969 debut, Kick Out the Jams, captured that frenzy, blending hard rock with a sense of urgency that felt dangerous and exhilarating. The opening line alone, shouted from the stage, became an anthem for disaffected youth. Yet, despite their influence, mainstream stardom eluded them. Radio stations shied away from their uncompromising message, and controversy often overshadowed their artistry. Still, for those who experienced them, MC5 felt like a revolution on vinyl. Imagine being in a smoky Detroit club in '68, the amps buzzing, the band launching into a barrage of sound that rattled your chest. The energy was physical. You didn't just hear MC5, you felt them. For a generation that was angry, restless, and ready for change, their music was gasoline on the fire. Their impact stretched far beyond their short-lived commercial run. Bands like The Clash, Ramones, and countless punk and hard rock acts carried MC5's DNA in their own sound. They proved that rock could be more than entertainment. It could be a weapon, a statement, a rallying cry, and while they may not have sold out stadiums, their underground influence reshaped the future of heavy music. Looking back, MC5 stand as one of the great, unappreciated forces of the 60s. They weren't polished, they weren't safe, but that was the point. They gave us rock in its rawest, most explosive form, straight from Detroit's gritty streets. For those who remember them, MC5 weren't just a band. They were a movement, a flash of sonic lightning that still rumbles decades later. The Small Faces may not have conquered the world like the Beatles or The Who, but in mid-60s Britain, they were a force of nature. Formed in London in 1965, this band brought together Steve Marriott's powerhouse vocals, Ronnie Lane's melodic bass, Kenny Jones's tight drumming, and Ian McLagan's soulful keyboards. Their sound was sharp, gritty, and irresistibly catchy. A mix of mod swagger and soulful rock energy that perfectly captured the vibe of swinging London. Their early hits like Sha-La-La-La-Lee and All or Nothing made them household names across the UK. Yet somehow they never broke through in America the way their peers did. Still, their blend of hard-driving riffs and Marriott's raw, emotional delivery gave them a distinct identity. They weren't just another British invasion band. They had an edge, a fire that set them apart. For fans who remember them in their prime, the Small Faces weren't just about the music. They were about the lifestyle. Picture yourself in 1966, strolling through Carnaby Street in a sharp, tailored suit, the sound of All or Nothing blasting from a record shop. They were the soundtrack to the mod generation. Youthful, stylish, and bursting with energy. Their songs carried the thrill of being young in a rapidly changing world. Even as the decade wore on, the Small Faces refused to stand still. By 1968, they were venturing into psychedelia with tracks like Itchycoo Park and the ambitious Ogden's Nut Gone Flake album, proving they could evolve with the times. Yet, despite their talent, internal struggles and management woes kept them from reaching the global heights they deserved. Looking back now, the Small Faces remain one of the great underrated treasures of 60s rock. They bridged the gap between R and B grit and psychedelic wonder, leaving behind songs that still sparkle with vitality. And for those who lived through their era, the memory of Steve Marriott's voice soaring through a packed club or over a tinny radio speaker is something you never quite forget. In the early 1960s, when the American folk revival was in full swing, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band stormed out of Chicago with something rawer, grittier, and far more electrifying. Formed in 1963 by harmonica master Paul Butterfield, they became one of the first interracial rock bands to blend authentic Chicago blues with the surging energy of rock and roll. Their lineup was stacked with legends in the making. Guitarist Mike Bloomfield's fiery leads, Elvin Bishop's soulful rhythm work, Jerome Arnold's bass, and Sam Lay's pounding drums, all anchored by Butterfield's searing harmonica and commanding vocals. Their debut album in 1965 was a revelation. It wasn't polished pop. It was loud, brash, and alive, filled with extended jams and improvisation that helped lay the groundwork for blues rock's dominance later in the decade. Songs like Born in Chicago carried the urgency of the city's streets, while their take on blues standards introduced a whole new generation to the roots of rock. At a time when most American rock bands were still mimicking British invasion acts, Butterfield's group sounded authentic, steeped in tradition, but blazing toward the future. They reached a wider audience at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, when they famously backed Bob Dylan during his controversial Electric set. That night changed music history forever, and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band was at the center of it, helping bridge the gap between folk and rock, between acoustic purity and amplified rebellion. For listeners, their music felt like a revelation. Imagine being a college kid in 1966, slipping on their record for the first time. The harmonica cut through the speakers like a lightning bolt. The guitars snarled with bluesy fire, and suddenly, you weren't just listening. You were transported to a Chicago club where sweat, smoke, and sound blended into something unforgettable. Their music carried grit and soul, but also a sense of authenticity that made it timeless. Though they never became chart-topping superstars, their influence was immense. They paved the way for blues-inspired rock giants like Cream, Led Zeppelin, and the Allman Brothers Band, proving that the roots of the blues could fuel stadium-shaking rock. Butterfield himself became a mentor figure to countless musicians, his harmonica playing setting a standard that still resonates today. Looking back, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band might not be the first name people recall when thinking of the 60s, but they deserve their place in rock's golden pantheon. They were pioneers, bringing blues out of the clubs and into the mainstream of rock, shaping the sound of a decade. For those who first heard them in their prime, they weren't just a band. They were a force, a reminder that rock's soul has always been rooted in the blues. And there you have it, 10 underrated bands from the 1960s that proved rock history wasn't only written by the giants. These groups may not have filled stadiums or topped every chart, but their sound, spirit, and innovation still echo today. For many of us, they were the soundtrack to nights of discovery, afternoons with the radio, and friendships forged over vinyl. Which of these forgotten treasures takes you back the most? Share your memories in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more trips through rock's golden age. Until next time, keep the vinyl spinning.